Michael Palin and Maggie Smith making pigs of themselves in a private function at 10 to midnight, right after we find out what the Pythons did next on 4. Wait for it.
Monty Python was arguably the most influential comedy group ever assembled. For decades, people the world over have been recreating their finest moments.
We have our man from the Ministry of Silly Walks who's going to show us the John Cleese Silly Walk.
It's nearly 40 years since 6 well-educated young men came together to create a colossal comedy brand. Massively popular, hugely lucrative, and culturally all-conquering.
This is an ex-parrot. It has ceased to be, expired, and gone to meet its maker.
But at the height of their success in 1974, the Python team decided that there wouldn't be any more TV shows. The band was splitting up, and each of the 6 members would be going their separate ways. This is the story of what the Pythons did next. The roots of the comedy giant that would become Monty Python go back to the mid-60s and the Oxbridge universities. Cambridge chums Cleese and Chapman had already worked together on the successful ITV comedy series At Last, the 1948 show. Meanwhile, Oxford University graduates Michael Palin and Terry Jones had teamed up with Eric Idle and a very boyish David Jason on the ITV kids show Do Not Adjust Your Set. In 1969, the BBC put them together to make the first series of Flying Circus.
The effect on me and my peers at the time was you know, you couldn't quantify it. It was huge. It was this explosion of nonsense, delightful nonsense.
The creative factions in the group were clear from the start, and the Cambridge men quickly developed a signature style. Barry Cryer knew them both at the time.
You could spot a Cleese-Chapman sketch. There was always some involved two-handed conversation going on that veered off into other directions.
Eddie, baby, when you first...
I'm sorry. I don't like being called Eddie, baby.
I'm sorry?
I don't like being called Eddie, baby.
Did I call you Eddie, baby?
Yes, you did. Now get on with it.
Don't think I did call you Eddie, baby.
I didn't call you Eddie, baby.
Did I call him Eddie, baby?
No. Yes. No.
I didn't really call you Eddie, baby, did I, sweetie?
Don't call me a sweetie!
But the two writing partners employed strikingly different methods.
Cleese and Chapman worked together in the same room, often with Chapman staring into the middle distance for 20 minutes at a time and then coming up with something brilliant. Cleese, who was a great, I think almost a pedant, who would work over and over and over and over lines again until they were right.
Oxford boys Terry Jones and Michael Palin wrote together and had a different style to the Cambridge pair. Python actress Carol Cleveland observed it firsthand.
There was very different camps, which showed itself in the writing when they came to doing Python. The Oxford side was very visual and romantic and emotional, because that had Terry Jones, who was a mad, fiery, emotional Welshman.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you, on the nurse organ, the bells of St. Mary. Thank you. Oh, my God! Stop him!
Jones's performances were passionate, physical, and sometimes violent. But his collaborator Michael Palin tended towards a more subtle kind of character.
Palin you would put down as the everyman figure, and he would often, you know, have his tank top and his moustache and his glasses and, as I say, meekly go and knock on doors to be confronted by one of the horrendous creations of the others.
Together. Deirdre, that's my wife, has always been a very good companion to me. Well, I never particularly anticipated any marital strife. Indeed, the very idea of consulting a professional marital advisor has always been of the greatest repugnance to me. Although far be it from me to impugn the nature of your trade or profession.
Do go on.
The Oxford-Cambridge divide defined the creative process within the group, but there was another Cambridge graduate in the gang who was a one-man faction, Eric Idle.
Well, Eric, of course, was a little bit of an outsider in that he's the only one who wrote on his own.
Nudge, Nudge, Wink, Wink, of course, was the classic of Eric. He wrote monologues that were a torrent of words, and he was your wordsmith who could dazzle you with verbal pyrotechnics.
Your wife, does she
Does she go? Hey, 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 know what I mean, nudge, nudge, say no more.
Oh, she sometimes goes, yes.
I bet she does, I bet she does, know what I mean, nudge, nudge.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow you.
Oh, follow me. I like that, that's good. A nod's as good as a wink to a blind bat, eh?
The last Python member came from neither Oxford nor Cambridge, but Minneapolis. American animator Terry Gilliam moved to London in the late 60s. Someone who knew Gilliam when he was just a humble cartoonist on US college magazines is the voice of The Simpsons' Mr. Burns and Spinal Tap legend Harry Shearer.
Terry always had a brilliant visual imagination. He's verbally funny, but his visual imagination is just how it was even then, as a kid, spectacular.
Gilliam had worked with Palin, Jones and Idle on Do Not Adjust Your Set and was the obvious choice to provide the visual style for the series. His animations mixed original illustrations with cutouts from old pictures and made Monty Python's Flying Circus an instantly recognizable brand. The show became a TV cult, but during their North American tour of 1973, at the height of their success, Cleese dropped a bombshell. He announced to the others that he wanted out of the most successful British TV comedy series ever. Python musical collaborator Neil Innes could see why.
He was fed up with arguing with Jones because, you know, he'd been having a discussion with Terry, and Terry still does this to this day. He'll suddenly go, "Oh, look, I think trees are so green," you know, in the middle of, damn it, I was getting to the point then, you know. So that irritated John in those days.
Without Cleese, there would be no more Monty Python's Flying Circus. The others decided to make one more series, this time called simply Monty Python. John Howard Davis, who produced the first series, thought it was a mistake.
When John decided to leave, it certainly left a big hole in the programme because his authority and his presence was, I think, an integral part of the show.
They probably had a good bank of material that they were able to draw on. And it's very different when you get to your fourth series, because you've drawn on all that material. I think that's when they would have started to find that, you know, the bottom drawer, there was not very much left.
After 6 episodes struggling on without Cleese, in 1974 they called it a day, and it was the end of Monty Python on TV. So, what did the Pythons do next? John Cleese, the first Python to leave the group and break out on his own. With the comedy world at his feet, what did he do next? In 1974, free of Python commitments, Cleese was able to start work on a whole variety of non-Python projects. He wrote for the Doctor-at-Large series, appeared in The Goodies, and became a regular on Says Les, a mainstream ITV comedy show hosted by Northern Club comic Les Dawson. And even here, Cleese brought a sense of Python anarchy with his unique physical comedy.
And we've just heard that there is trouble in an ITN News studio. Mr. Reginald Hawkins had gained entrance and was trying to read the news when top reporter Sandy Smythe forcibly removed him from in front of the camera. We hope to bring you more about that with pictures later on in the programme. Now for some news regarding...
Following their visit to Scotland, the Queen...
Get off! Give me hands, please, get it. No. Oh!
The Queen said it,
The wonderful odd couple, Les Dawson and John Cleese, it seemed so incongruous, and it was mutual admiration, sort of love at first sight. And these two men from two different backgrounds and everything really hit it off.
It was a very unlikely comedy pairing, but the most important collaborator of his immediate post-Python period would be someone he met in America.
John Cleese was enjoying New York very much, and he went to this particular restaurant, this cafe. A very, very nice waitress served him, actually. She was an actress working when she wasn't working, and this was Connie Booth, and they got on with each other almost immediately.
In 1968, the couple married. Booth moved to London, and they even started working together on screen.
Do you want to go?
No.
Shall I go?
No.
Shall we both go? Or stay? Or either one of us could go or stay separately or together. It's up to you.
Oh.
Oh dear, now you're angry again.
I'm not.
You are.
I'm not.
You are. I'll keep quiet. I'll keep quiet. Happy?
Yes.
Comfortable? Sure?
Yes.
Do you want to change places? Shall we go somewhere else?
No.
Really?
Yes.
Shall I get another chair? Am I fussing you too much? Phew, I thought she'd never go.
With his Python TV commitments out of the way, Cleese and Booth had the time to create a new project together. The inspiration came, surprisingly, from Cleese's work on the London weekend television sitcom Doctor at Large. In 1971, he'd written an episode featuring an aggressive and incompetent manager of a small-town hotel. He's an early version of Basil Fawlty.
Upton, Mr. Upton.
Well, Dr. Upton, it doesn't matter.
This terrible manager was to become the basis for one of the greatest sitcoms of all time, Fawlty Towers. Andrew Sachs played put-upon-waiter Manuel.
A lot of people, the audiences, think that it's John Cleese wrote Fawlty Towers, whereas in fact it was a double act. It was his Connie Booth, his wife. He has the technique of forming a joke, a bit of comedy, plot line and so on, but I think she probably brought into it the human qualities, the elements of relationship and difficult relationships.
Sure. Oh. What? Hello, dear.
What are you doing?
I'm kissing you, dear.
Well, don't.
Oh, I just thought it might be nice.
Very often when you see classic television sitcoms, you think, oh, this is very charming. It's still very charming, beautifully done, but it's got a bit slow, hasn't it? But Fawlty Towers, it's still staggeringly fast. I mean, I think that is very much John, and Connie as well, but John's pace is still an example to modern sitcom.
Again! Harder! Right, I'll call O'Reilly. What is this? I mean, what is this doing? What is going on here?
I think he's an extremely passionate person and understands sort of anger and fear and aggression and as most good writers do.
The creative energy of the husband and wife partnership ensured that Fawlty Towers was a huge success. But after the first series, Cleese's relationship with Connie was already under great strain.
I had no idea they were having difficulties with their marriage, but I noticed, for example, I'd come into rehearsal rooms at Acton, and John was there, maybe, and the rest of the cast, ready to start rehearsal at 10 or whatever it was. And 5 minutes later, Connie would come in, and I thought, oh, she just parked the car. But no, she would go up to him and kiss, good morning, darling, have a nice breakfast. Did you? Yeah, how are you? Sleep well? I thought, well, hang on, that's not quite right. So, in fact, they were living separate lives then, I imagine.
They separated in 1976. But the two series they wrote together would become, over time, one of the most successful British sitcoms ever. And he was equally busy in other areas. Video Arts was a company co-founded by Cleese that made training videos for industry.
Who sold you this, then?
And he wasn't afraid to trade on his comedy reputation.
Certainly, Cleese has a great business brain. And was always known by the others who were a bit more sort of hippified as the breadhead of the group.
So I remember at the time people pompously saying, oh, Cleese is selling out and all this and everything. But it's that foresight. Well, of course, it was a great success. They collared a part of the market other people hadn't spotted. It was typically John.
In 1986, this modest business was sold for a very serious £50 million. The 80s were good for John Cleese. The huge success of Monty Python on TV and film meant that he now had the leverage to make movies in his own right. He wrote and starred in Clockwise in 1986, but his biggest hit came 2 years later.
There was a feeling at the end of A Fish Called Wanda that John Cleese had it in him to be a romantic leading man, because if you remember, I mean, he worked out, and there's a scene where he strips off, and he's got a good figure, you know, good muscle definition, all the rest of it.
Святая Преалистова, не? И души, как бремя скатится, сомнения далеко, и верится, и плачется, и так легко,
Cleese tried the formula again, reuniting the cast of A Fish Called Wanda for 1997's Fierce Creatures, but it couldn't recreate Wanda's success.
There's a smoothness to A Fish Called, but there isn't in Fierce Creatures. And in Fierce Creatures, things seem to happen because somebody thinks, oh, that would be funny. And that is not the way to make a farce. And it didn't work for me.
Now living in Santa Barbara, it appears Cleese is content to make regular cameo appearances in other people's movies and become the grand old man of British comedy.
He has now almost become a parody of those characters he used to parody. Rather bluff, rather retired colonel-ish, little stuffy. I'm sure it's all an affectation, but it's beginning to cling. It's like the rubber mask that won't come off the face.
So for John Cleese, his mighty solo career has grown to rival his reputation as a python. Eric Idle. As the only python to write on his own when the group split, he should have been perfectly suited to a solo career. So what did Eric Idle do next? During the 4 Monty Python TV series, Idle didn't have an easy ride. Robert Hewison, author of Monty Python, The Case Against, was a friend of the Pythons.
Then you had Eric Idle, was, and I still think probably is, still a loner. And that's where he gets his drive from being a loner. And of course, having to work twice as hard as the others to get his stuff in.
Eric, I think, had all sorts of things in mind that he wanted to get on with, and he had ideas that he would have liked to collaborate with them on, but they weren't interested. So I think he was very determined to make a go of that on his own.
Now free from having to compromise with the others, he could finally realise his own projects. Although the TV series had finished, the BBC were keen to keep any of the Pythons on the channel, and in 1975 Idle wasted no time pitching his next project, Rutland Weekend Television. Co-writer and Rutland regular Neil Innes.
The idea behind Rutland Weekend Television, and again Eric's interest in satirising television, was that all the franchises were coming up for independent television companies. So he thought, well, why not go with the smallest county? They'd have the lowest budgets, and therefore it would be very cheap-looking television.
It's that whole thing of that he's got a television channel with nothing to say. And there's that whole fanfare about them going on air, and he's just sat there in the studio, and he's just going, well, yes. And they just stay on him for an uncomfortably long time. And that was just really pleasing.
Good evening. A very, very special welcome to the very, very first evening's viewing on Rutland Weekend Television tonight. It's a very, very special occasion, as you can imagine. There's a very, very special party going on, as you can imagine, live in the centre of Rutland tonight, as you can imagine. All the stars, as you can imagine, are there waiting to talk to Pete Murray, as you can imagine. But before we go over there, I'm going to have a little something here with you just to celebrate, as you can imagine. Great.
Idle was the first Python to have his own series, beating Fawlty Towers to air by 5 months in May 1975. And although Neil Innes contributed heavily, it was clear that it was very much Idle's show.
On Rutland Weekend Television, I mean, it wasn't that Eric was difficult to work with, but it was noticeable that he was untroubled by doubt.
It seemed that the confidence and status that came with being an ex-Python also gave Idle the clout to attract A-list guests. And there isn't much more A-list than ex-Beatle George Harrison, however bad his acting.
But first of all, 30 pieces of parrot.
Good evening.
Hi, Long John.
Yes, very nice, very nice. Yes, you'll be able to sing in a minute, thank you.
I sing?
Yes, in a minute, ladies and gentlemen, the incomparable larynx of the quiet one from the Fab Four will be here to sing you some of his best hits.
I'm not here to sing, I'm here to act.
Act?
Yes.
Although Rutland Weekend Television was very much the Eric Idle show, it was Neil Innes who came up with the idea that the series would be best remembered for.
Because it's cheapskate television, I thought an idea would be to parody A Hard Day's Night. You know, black and white film, 4 guys with wigs and pointy shoes. Just how expensive is that?
I feel good, I feel good, I feel bad, I feel bad, I feel happy, I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel sad, I'm in love, I must be in love, I must be in love.
Ruttle's drummer John Halsey remembers that when it came to writing the Beatles parodies, Innes and Idle found it useful to have a friend or two on hand.
Neil had to sit down and write however many Beatles songs with copyright problems. I think George was always on hand to check things through. At one point, I think John was involved when we did Get Up and Go, which was like Get Back, and between them they thought it was a bit too close. So I think it was changed.
The Ruttles parodies were spot on, and not just the music. Even the facial hair was accurate. Word of the Ruttles spread to the USA, where Idol soon found backers to fund his first feature-length project. The Ruttles movie spoofed the entire history of the Beatles, including an amazingly detailed take on the band's legendary performance of All You Need Is Love. The film finally gave Idol the solo success he was looking for, and after Life of Brian in 1980, he moved to the United States to forge a new career in the movies.
Eric's film career was rather like sort of Tim Henman, really. If you see what I mean. It's nearly, but not quite.
With appearances in films like Splitting Heirs and Nuns on the Run, Idol was still looking for a hit, and in 1997 he decided to revisit former glories by making a new Ruttles movie, Ruttles 2, Can't Buy Me Lunch. This time Idol didn't involve Neil Innes, and the sequel wasn't well received, not even by one of the Ruttles.
And then lo and behold, he remakes it and issues Ruttles 2, which is just the most awful thing I've ever seen in my life. Just absolutely embarrassing. I couldn't even watch it all the way through. It's so embarrassing.
So 20 years since his last Python project, Idol was still looking to establish a career beyond Python.
Idol is the man who never really progressed beyond Python and spent a long time in Hollywood trying to find a role for a former member of Monty Python, and did some tours on his own, basically to make some money. And the names were a bit of a giveaway. One of them a few years ago was called the Greedy Bastard Tour.
It looked like he might become the most underachieving member of the gang, but in 2005 he went back to what he knows best, Monty Python. In 1975, the group had made their own version of the King Arthur legend, called the Holy Grail. 30 years later, Idol returned to the film and turned it into a musical, Spamalot.
Eric has definitely been in the vanguard of pushing, well, let's say it, I'm sure it would be Eric's phrase, of milking the Python cow to the point where, you know, her udders are threadbare.
Spamalot has proved so popular that there are now versions running in New York and London. And in 1 year, it's already made more than £50 million.
Eric Idle is really, in some ways, the forgotten member of the group, but mock not, because according to Gilliam, he is now the richest Python of all.
Now perhaps the most financially successful Python, it seems Idle's move to America may have worked out after all.
You can live in Los Angeles too long and pick up kind of lifestyle habits that aren't necessarily compatible with social skills. But we were worried about him for quite a while because he did appear to be suffering from delusions. But now we're all happy to say there's only grandeur.
So Eric Idle has finally found a successful career as an ex-Python by going back to Monty Python. Cleese and Idle managed to find a life after Python. But what about the rest? Monty Python's last TV show was in 1974. So what did Graham Chapman do next? During Flying Circus, Graham Chapman had written sketches primarily with fellow Cambridge graduate John Cleese. Their educations were similar, but their styles wildly different.
I think they were an odd couple. Graham was prone to sort of bursts of creativity, not a methodical, straight down the line writer. Graham had wonderful imagination, and I think John would have to harness that.
On screen, Chapman often played very straight-laced authority figures.
Started off with a nice little idea about grannies attacking young men, but now it's got silly. Man's hair's too long for a vicar, too.
But off-screen, he was something completely different.
Right. Now for a complete change of mood.
It was quite a shock to everybody when he suddenly announced he was homosexual. This man with a tweed jacket with leather patches on, who's smoking a pipe. Yes, actually, I'm gay. I'm like, oh.
I was quite happy with the way you know, I thought my bit seemed, you know...
What?
being so overtly gay, which at that time wasn't quite the done thing. I didn't quite know how to cope with that. I mean, he was quite outrageous at times, quite outrageous.
Well, actually, yes, I thought your performance was quite adequate. Oh, you bitch!
By the time Flying Circus finished in 1974, Cleese and Chapman had been writing together for over 8 years. But now Cleese had decided to move on, which meant that Chapman needed a new collaborator. Doctor in Charge was a prime-time situation comedy on ITV. As a trained doctor himself, Chapman was considered perfect to help write the series. Realising that he needed a new writing buddy, the producers decided to hook him up with a rookie writer called Bernard McKenna.
Barry Cryer and John Cleese had both attempted to write a bit with Graham. I don't know what happened, but I was put with him. And it was good for me, and it was good for Graham. Graham was a very lazy writer. And so you would do all the writing, and he would just have weird ideas that you would then try and incorporate.
However, McKenna quickly learnt that working with Graham Chapman had its problems.
When I first worked with him, he drank Carlsberg specials from about 11:30 in the morning. He'd only got up at 10:30. As we wrote the Doctor series together, he moved on to gin and tonics at about 11:30, 12, from an optic that was in his office. He would just puff away on the pipe, talk to me and go, hello, and slurp away. And so it got pretty serious.
As an ex-Python, though, Chapman still was considered quite a catch by the BBC, and in 1975 he approached them with an idea.
Out of the Trees was Graham approaching the BBC saying, I'd like to do a silly sketch show starring me, written by me. They thought, that sounds good.
They're so pretty.
What are?
The peonies. Look. Isn't it pretty?
What's this then?
A peony.
Oh, you admit that then?
But look, officer.
Don't try to flatter me. You won't get out of it that way.
Out of the Trees actor and future Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy star Simon Jones was unconvinced.
But this is ridiculous.
It was achingly familiar in style. This seemed rather Python-esque.
Unfortunately for Chapman, the BBC weren't impressed, and only one episode was ever broadcast. In fact, for years it was considered lost, but some of the sketches have recently been rediscovered and are shown here for the first time in 30 years.
Rape me, not her! Shut up! It's me who wants to rape.
I wasn't altogether surprised when it wasn't picked up, largely because I don't suppose it could be said to have represented a real breakthrough.
Plans for a series were scrapped, but it wasn't just the familiarity of the material that made the BBC reluctant to continue with Chapman.
They're very aware if somebody comes off from a recording and downs 3 or 4 pints of gin that this might not be the best possible person to set up a series with. So I think they just let it go.
Undeterred, Chapman immediately threw himself into his next non-Python project, this time as a leading man.
Graham did a really, really good movie, which no one's ever seen, called The Odd Job, which co-starred David Jason. It's basically a story of a guy that's sort of been left by his wife and this whole sort of world's crumbling, and he actually hires a complete stranger to kill him.
Got any odd jobs?
What?
Got any odd jobs?
No, but there might be something you can do for me.
But this was Graham wanted to push this project through. He wanted to rewrite the script, which he did with me, not very happily. And by then, Graham had decided to play the lead.
You could get killed.
Yes, I could.
You want to get killed?
Yes.
And I'm to do it?
Please.
At least we had David Jason, who gave a good performance, but Graham didn't. And I think the film suffered from his meddling.
The Odd Job had a short cinema release in 1978 and then disappeared.
I've changed my mind! I want to live!
Now's a fine time to tell me, isn't it?
By 1979, Chapman's solo career had stalled. Fortunately, the Pythons were back, and he was given the lead role in their next movie, The Life of Brian. This time, he was determined to make a success of it and finally gave up the drink.
By the time we came to do Life of Brian, Graham was pretty dry, and he was very determined. He just wanted it to be a good time and do everything right, which he did, and he was wonderful in the part. And I think that was a great relief to everybody, great relief.
It would become his defining role, but after playing the king in The Holy Grail, he was reluctant to take the lead again.
Talking to me one day, he said, "I'm the leading man. I'm the leading man. I want a funny part." It was almost as if he resented being the leading man. You know, like the straight man, ironically, around which all the others were capering about, being funny and everything.
Wait a minute. Well, we're supposed to haggle. No, I've got to get... What do you mean, no? I haven't got time. Well, give it back then. No, I just paid you. Bert? Yeah. This bloke won't haggle.
Chapman's brilliant straight man performance helped make Life of Brian a huge success worldwide. He was now comedy A-list, and with that came plenty of famous friends and the opportunity to try to make it in Los Angeles.
Graham was lost in LA, really. He had a few rock and roll friends, and there was a lot of cocaine around, and this became his substitute for alcohol.
Despite the problems, his time in Hollywood and his Python reputation still gave Chapman film opportunities, and in 1983 he wrote and starred in the pirate comedy Yellowbeard. Frustratingly for Chapman, it was another flop. When the TV and film work dried up in the 80s, he became a professional raconteur. His wild lifestyle had given him one thing: plenty of crazy stories that he could retell on the lucrative college lecture circuit in America, where he showed that he'd lost none of his Python-esque wit.
I don't know whether you've ever tried that at 5 o'clock in the morning, to inject a couple of cc's of concentrated solution of penicillin into your right buttock, but it's pretty difficult even after 4 or 5 large scotches.
Sadly, Chapman's comedy career was never to have a renaissance. In 1989, he died of complications brought on by throat cancer. His last work was, strangely, for the heavy metal group Iron Maiden, starring in their video, Can I Play With Madness?
Graham is the one who was desperate to do something after Python that worked. That's what really bugged him. He wanted something that really worked. But it never seemed to come together for him with one of his own ventures. He was so likeable, but he may have not made enemies in the business that definitely created a totally reliable reputation for being unreliable.
Outside the group, Chapman's career never really flowered, but he'll be best remembered for his 2 brilliant performances in Monty Python's finest films. Michael Palin and Terry Jones were the Oxford-educated wing of Monty Python's Flying Circus. When the group split, what did they do next?
Once Monty Python broke up as a team, Michael Palin, I think, was seen as the great hope by the BBC. He was being singled out as maybe a variety host, chat show host and that sort of thing. But when they suggested that to Michael Palin, I don't think he was very impressed with that idea.
Understandably, Palin didn't fancy becoming the new Bruce Forsyth. Instead, he chose to keep working with his Flying Circus writing partner, Terry Jones. They came up with Ripping Yarns. Avoiding the Flying Circus sketch format, each episode was a different boy's own adventure tale with Palin in the lead role. Steve Pemberton of the League of Gentlemen is a long-standing Ripping Yarns fan.
Moving from sketch writing, you do, as a writer, you grow and you feel you want to tackle the half-hour format. There's plenty of physical humour, plenty of silliness, and of course it retained their trademark humour.
And there was St. Tadger's Day, when, by an old tradition, boys who had been at the school for less than 2 years were allowed to be nailed to the walls by senior people.
Although it was never as well known as Flying Circus, Ripping Yarns would become just as big an influence on a later generation of comedy performers.
But, you know, I think that the Ripping Yarns series was a greater influence on the League of Gentlemen than what they did in the Flying Circus, because it's very, very funny, and it's got that Palin and Jones mischievous humour, but I think very seedy and dark elements to it as well. He was able to be a bit more subversive, perhaps. So there is the case in Tompkinson's School Days where the school bully comes and, you know, offers him cocaine in order to win a race, you know, which they don't make a big deal of it, but it's just in there as a sort of sly reference for those who get it, and for those who don't, it's a bit of snuff.
Gosh. Yes, there you are. I ought to keep you on your foot for a bit. Well, good luck. You dismally untalented little creep.
The variety of roles in Ripping Yarns enabled Palin to develop his acting range, and in the 80s he went on to pursue a successful career as a character actor. Appearances in films like The Missionary, A Private Function and A Fish Called Wanda established him as one of Britain's best comedy actors.
I'd love to see Michael Palin do more acting, and maybe, you know, in the future he'll do a little comeback, because he clearly could have been still now one of our greatest actors.
Whilst Palin concentrated on a performing career, Terry Jones seemed keener to work behind the camera. His big directing break came in 1979, when the Python team reunited for Life of Brian. He proved to be an extremely talented director, as shown by his staging of The Crucifixion as a song and dance number.
So always look on the bright side of death. Just before you draw your terminal breath.
The success of Life of Brian secured Jones' reputation as a director, and in 1983 he was the driving force behind what was to be the final Monty Python film, The Meaning of Life. In it, Jones would create a scene that would become perhaps his most memorable.
The scene at the end with Jones in a giant rib cage with that little heart in the bottom pumping away. Miss Crusoe is visually probably the sickest moment in modern cinema.
Oh, just one. Just the one. Yeah. Voila. Bon appétit.
Despite high expectations, the team couldn't recapture the magic of Life of Brian. The Meaning of Life signalled the end of Python as a unit, but not the end of Jones's directing career. In the 80s, he went on to direct some critically acclaimed films, including Personal Services and Eric the Viking. But after a promising start, Jones chose not to pursue a high-profile career in the movies.
He didn't quite go on to make a career in directing the same way that Terry Gilliam did. And it's a shame, because I think, you know, those films showed a lot of promise.
By the end of the 80s, Palin too had drifted away from the movies and returned to TV, where the BBC cast him in a surprising new role, the new Alan Wicker. In an adventure reminiscent of a Ripping Yarns hero, Palin recreated Jules Verne's Round the World in 80 Days, an epic journey where he maintained his cheery persona no matter how tough the environment.
And I'm going to drop the handkerchief now. Oh, well, as you can see, the wind not quite as violent as we thought. It's blowing at about, just do a calculation here, 1 knot.
In the 90s, Jones took a similar path to Palin, moving away from movies and concentrated on his personal fascination.
Terry Jones now makes quite serious films about history. He's obsessed with medieval history, and he writes wonderful children's books. And he's possibly left comedy behind him more than anyone else.
He always looks very happy and chilled out and not stressed by his life or the fact that he's not doing this or that. And he just appears to be a very likeable chap who you'd like to sit down and have a drink with.
So, whilst they may not have been the most prolific solo Pythons, the quality of Palin and Jones's work is not in doubt. And now they seem very content with their new roles as ex-Pythons. There's one Python remaining. What did Terry Gilliam do next? Terry Gilliam was the maverick American animator with ambitions outside comedy. So when the Monty Python gang split, what did he do next? In the TV series, Terry Gilliam's job was to provide the visual glue that held the sketches together.
Terry Gilliam was someone who worked on his own and clearly, I think, kind of went a bit mad in his studio creating these amazing animations. And what it did is it gave a trademark and it gave a look which spread out into the rest of the show.
Animations like this one meant Flying Circus included a level of grotesque surrealism previously unseen on TV.
The BBC had reported that Radio Free Solent, a parent station, was marking the first birthday of the BBC's Southampton-based Radio Solent.
Turn that television off! You know it's bad for your eyes!
It was clear that Gilliam's head was coming from an even weirder place than the other Pythons.
Terry Gilliam, from a completely different background in every possible way. He was somebody who was a great subversive and radical, both within the group and without it.
On Holy Grail, Gilliam had shared directing responsibilities with Jones, a frustrating experience for an ambitious director. So when Python split in 1975, he was keen to take total control of his next movie, Jabberwocky.
Jabberwocky, I think, is probably Terry Gilliam thinking, screw Terry Jones, I don't need to work with him on a Monty Python film, I can do my own film.
Although he wanted to move away from Monty Python, Gilliam chose Palin for the lead and gave Jones a memorable cameo.
Essentially, it is a kind of savage satire on the Middle Ages. It's not necessarily a particularly funny film. I mean, there are funny moments in it, but it is, in many ways, it's quite a serious film. Terry Jones as the poacher being attacked by the Jabberwocky at the beginning is a very grim scene, actually, a very grim scene.
Jabberwocky failed to set the box office alight, disappointing in particular Python fans who were expecting a sequel to Holy Grail. Sandy Lieberson was Gilliam's producer on the movie.
It suffered in a way because it wasn't the Python film, yet people identified it as a Python film. And it was very hard to generate a clear and focused profile for Jabberwocky as a movie on its own.
By 1978, Gilliam was the only Python to have directed a complete feature film. But when it came to the life of Brian, they turned to Terry Jones. And when the final Python movie, The Meaning of Life, came along, Jones got the job again. But this time, they did ask Gilliam to direct what was supposed to be a short sequence in the movie. Typically, Gilliam had other ideas.
He came back with 20 minutes of film. You know, they didn't want anything like 20 minutes of film. And he'd spent £1 million, I think, which was most of the budget. But it was so good that in the end it ran to about 16 minutes.
Gilliam's not-so-short The Crimson Permanent Assurance was about a finance company whose elderly staff mutiny and become a bunch of ruthless pirate accountants. It featured a visual flair and absurdist imagination that would become a Gilliam trademark.
It's fun to charter an accountant and sail the wide accountancy to find, explore the funds offshore and skirt the shoals of bankruptcy.
The Pythons may not have chosen him as director on their films, but away from the group, he was developing a reputation as a unique filmmaker. The movie that really broke through was Brazil in 1985. More political than anything he'd made before, it showed Jonathan Pryce trapped in a hellish vision of the future where personal liberties were non-existent.
Now do stop, sir, please. Jill! Jill!
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear.
No! Oh! Sorry about that, sir. Regulations.
Gilliam became one of the world's most original directors, making such classics as The Fisher King and 12 Monkeys.
Terry comes out of that tradition of the individual filmmaker who is not part of the establishment, who doesn't always make the great box office hit. But when you look at the body of work, it's amongst the best out there.
Gilliam may be an original, but along the way he's made some notorious flops, including The Brothers Grimm and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and he's attracted a reputation for going spectacularly over budget.
He's never going to be, you know, an ass-kissing director who'll deliver, you know, an under-budget film with a star that's going to make half its money again. He's a unique visionary director, and you know, we're very lucky to have him in this country.
And occasionally, Gilliam's maverick approach to filmmaking has led to fallouts with some of the people he's worked with.
Is he difficult? Yeah, he's difficult. Is he demanding? He's the most demanding because he sets his goals so high.
He has a vision. He wants to get it, and if you're in that position, compromise tends not to be in the vocabulary.
After the unimpressive box office of his most recent movie, Tideland, his currency as a director isn't as high as it has been, but many believe there's life in the old Python yet.
Of all the Pythons, Terry Gilliam is the only serious filmmaker. But I think we're still waiting for the Terry Gilliam masterpiece.
So, although he hasn't had a hit film for several years, Gilliam has thrived outside Python. And nearly 40 years since the birth of Flying Circus, his creative vision is just as weird as ever. Monty Python is still a huge comedy brand, but for the men who made it, how do their post-Python careers compare?
You've made one of the defining comedy series of British television history. Then you've topped that by doing one of the defining sitcoms of British television history, and kind of deserves 10 years off.
I think he loved being a Python and regretted when it ended and couldn't find what he really wanted to do.
I always thought Mike Palin was the funniest. Film career, globe-trotting traveller, writer and everything. I think, yeah, fully round, the great all-rounder.
He always looks very happy and chilled out and not stressed by his life or the fact that he's not doing this or that. So I think out of all of them, he appears to be, you know, one of the most happy with his lot, really.
I can't think of any other filmmaker who makes films quite like Terry does. They don't always work, but there's always something in them that grabs your attention. They're always worth watching.
Eric Idle, he's the one who's never distanced himself from Python. He's remained stitched to the hip of Python, and it's just come full circle. He seemed to be trailing behind the others in the stakes and the race, and now he's come right up to the tape with Spamalot, and I'm delighted.
So it looks like, for now, Eric Idle just has a nose in front by being the Python who really stayed a Python. But with such a creative group, who knows what the Pythons might do next?
Comedy of the American kind, brand new US hit Ugly Betty brings a new but ugly face to Friday nights here on 4, starting this Friday at 9:30. Next tonight, social climbing in post-war Britain. Michael Palin comes up against the wrong people in Alan Bennett's Private Function.